Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody for joining us this evening. We are 1 week on from the launch of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, so we've had a big week. Very successful launch last week, and we've been inundated with offers of help, potential connections, people who want to be involved, and I know a number of those people are in this audience. So thank you to you for your interest and ongoing support. We are at the task of building the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. Clearly that's going to take some time for us to be at the size and scale we would like to be, but me and the team are very enthused, so thank you for giving us the benefit of your energy and your thoughts. Last week, when we did the launch, we were talking about some big global statistics. The fact that we're only around about a quarter women for politicians, for judges, for news media leaders, and by the time you talk about corporate boards, we're down to 15%. So we talked about those big global figures. Tonight, we're going to take a different approach, and we're going to dive in to some particular industries and segments and try and work out what is going on in each of them to affect women's leadership. What's working, what's not working, what are the barriers? So I am joined by a fantastic panel, starting with Katharine, who is the Editor-in-Chief of The Guardian. I'm going to say this really quickly because they're going to introduce themselves. Zamila, who works at the Cabinet Office and has expertise on so many things, including matters associated with the public sector, but also a perspective not only from working here in London but around the world. And Joanna, who is from one of the world's biggest law firms, from Baker McKenzie. So we're going to dive in from that set of perspectives. Zamila, I'm going to ask you to go first. I'm going to ask you to briefly introduce yourself, but you, I know, are of the view that even though we're sophisticated, smart women, we don't see the world right. Is that your view?
Yes, that is my provocation for the evening and my challenge to you all. So my background briefly, as Julia said, is I'm a policy advisor in the Cabinet Office to the Prime Minister, but I've also worked in the United Nations, I've also worked in the Brookings Institute, so I have worked in other countries, and that's allowed me to see how we view gender in other countries. And so one thing that was very profound to me when I was in the UN, I was working in Darfur first and then in Nepal. And even in the desert of Darfur, you would be asking, where are the women in your program? Where is the funding that is going to women? You'd be asking, well, how many girls are in school? In the mountains of Nepal, we'd be asking, how much money in these programs is being bid for women's leadership? How many women do we have as politicians? And when I came back to the UK after 2 years of this, I was absolutely shocked at how this never was in the conversation. Nobody asked me as a policy advisor how much of this program is going to benefit women, how much of the funding is going to be allocated to women, how are we looking at STEM, engineers, women leaders, any of that conversation. So in the UN, it was part of my DNA, it was part of the lexicon that I had. And so when I came back to the UK, I wondered, have we suddenly achieved parity, that we're not talking about this? But also in terms of perceptions of where we think we are. Every time I do talk about gender, someone cites at me, the Scandinavian model is fantastic. I figured, let me look at this for myself. And when I did look at the Scandinavian numbers, turns out Sweden has one of the worst male parental leave numbers globally. So why are we suddenly thinking that Sweden has achieved everything? And why are we thinking that the global north has achieved parity when maybe some of the better examples are in countries that we don't expect? So that was one observation. The other was this recent conversation about the gender pay gap. I think it's wonderful that we're talking about this. I wondered, why haven't we been always talking about this? Why did it take a bit of legislation to force this conversation? And in the articles that I was looking at in the last few weeks, there was lots of practical advice for women. This is what you need to do now. Force a conversation with your boss. Force a conversation about pay or a bonus or more representation. And then I also wondered, I didn't see a single article that said what men need to do. When are men going to step up and say, okay, maybe here's the list of things that you now need to do to fix this problem? So I just wondered how it is that we've come at this in our lexicon. And then finally, the issue was, this isn't only about human resources. Whenever we talk about leadership or women's issues or equality issues, someone sends you a workforce person. It isn't about that. It's about systemic issues that I hope we talk about today. And then finally, my one just observation from a personal perspective is often I can't excuse the fact that I'm also an ethnic minority. I'm also a faith minority, and I happen to also be a woman. But I often get mistaken for the PA. And that, as a leader, you often wonder, how many times am I going to beat you over the head and tell you I'm not the PA. I actually do have the right to be here the same as other people. And so I wondered if that is something also that is going to provoke thought as we take this forward.
Thank you very much, Zamila. Thank you. A great place to start. Joanna, can I now turn to you from one of the world's biggest law firms. 100 years ago when I was young, I was a lawyer too. When I first started in law, I think the structure of the workplace was basically get in, work 1 million hours a week, hope the partner in the corner office would notice, keep your billable hours up, then maybe you'd make associate, and then if you worked another 100 hours a week, kept your billable hours up, then you might later in life hit the payout counter and become a partner. Is it still like that? And how does it work for women?
I think it's changed a bit, but not enough. And I've been a partner at Baker McKenzie since 2009. And I was the first female partner in the litigation team that the Baker McKenzie London office had ever had. And controversially, I was also 3 days a week. Actually, it was pretty open-minded for my firm to take that opportunity. I was a bit of a known quantity because I'd started my training life at Baker McKenzie, and then I decided that the grass was greener, and I went to Clifford Chance, and I spent 6 years there. And I had my 2 kids during that time and was working on a number of matters overseas, trying to do different time zones all in one day. And I decided that actually life was too short. I wasn't seeing enough of my children and I needed to work part-time. And so I was the first person to ask if I could work part-time in my team at Clifford Chance. And to my surprise, they said yes. But a few minutes later, I had a visit from the head of HR who said to me, "Jo, you realise that if you sign your part-time working arrangement, you're not going to be a partner here." And I think that was the first time that I thought, actually, this is a problem. I hadn't really realised when I was a law student or a graduate that being a woman in the workplace and having a family was at all problematic. And because everyone was saying yes to my part-time working request, I was thinking, oh, this is great. You can have it all. So instead of signing up for my part-time working arrangement, I handed in my resignation. And I went to a smaller law firm thinking that maybe in a small firm out of London, things would be different, but actually the pressures are still the same. The unconscious bias is still the same. And eventually I went back. I was actually approached to go back to Baker McKenzie, and they had the foresight to think that actually let's just give this a go. And I think what I took from that is that for me, that's what society needs to do. We need to give women opportunities, because when you give those opportunities, women do prove that they're capable of it. So to your question, Julia, about the billable hours, well, it's still very controversial. I was having a conversation today in with my Baker Women leadership team, and we were talking about, is the billable hour dead? And well, it's certainly not dead, but is it dying? And I think there's a good chunk of people who think it probably is, and that hopefully by the time my daughter, who's 15, goes into the profession, which is what she's thinking of doing, I hope there will be no billable hour, because I think that's a real impediment in the legal profession to getting women into senior positions.
Now, does that mean we're going to be getting our legal services for free? No. Oh, no. But that won't be the way in which work is measured anymore.
Well, I think actually the billable hour, ironically, is an impediment to really getting the best out of these commercial opportunities for law firms. Because if you think about it, the first time you ever look at a legal question, you might spend 10 hours doing it. But when the second client comes along and asks you the very same question, you know the answer, and you can't charge your client more than the time you spend to do it. So actually, if you look at things in terms of what is the value to our clients rather than how long are we taking to produce it, then it will be a much better situation all round, I think.
Oh, thank you. Katharine, if I was going to shout lunch for female editors of newspapers in the UK, what do you think it would cost me?
I'm a very expensive date.
Yeah, right. But it would just be you and me, wouldn't it?
It would now, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, Katharine's editor-in-chief at The Guardian.
Yes.
Can you introduce yourself and
Yes.
share your lens on these gender equality issues?
Yes, so I've been editor-in-chief of The Guardian for almost 3 years. Yes, I'm the first woman to do the job in the 197 years of The Guardian's history. And I'm responsible for all the journalism you see on The Guardian, The Observer, and all of our digital formats, which reach 165 million browsers around the world every month, 2/3 of those outside of the UK. It means we're one of the biggest English language news websites in the world. And I joined The Guardian in 1997 as a child and launched Guardian Australia in 2013, which is when I got to know Julia, who was the Prime Minister of Australia at the time. I also edited Guardian US in New York. And I like to say that The Guardian has always been feminist. We launched in 1821 in the aftermath of the Peterloo Massacre, which took place in 1819 in Manchester, which was a sort of seismic event in British history where people protested and were killed for the right to vote. It was the start of getting the right for universal suffrage. And what I didn't know until I investigated it recently, that the Peterloo was the first time that women had protested for the right to vote in Lancashire. So I like to think that even at the beginning of The Guardian, there was a feminist element. Our legendary editor, C.P. Scott, who was editor for 57 years, he was a supporter of Votes for Women, and he corresponded with Emmeline Pankhurst. I've got those letters, they're fantastic. And of course, The Guardian was home to the great feminist debates of the 20th century with the Guardian Women's Page, which started in 1922 and was particularly famous in the 60s and 70s and 80s. It's an interesting thing at The Guardian at the corporate level. We've had two women managing directors, Caroline Marland and Carolyn McCall, both fantastic. And I was inspired in my career by a wonderful female deputy editor, Georgina Henry. So I think, there's lots of reasons why I think we've got a feminist history. As the first woman editor, or just what I would do anyway, I've appointed many senior women into important roles, from the new editor of Guardian Australia to our political editors, who are two women who work in a job share in a very, very male-dominated lobby, our opinion editor, our chief sports reporter, Martha Kellner, who last month won the British Press Awards for Best Sports Reporter in Britain, and that's the first time a woman had ever won that. And quite a lot of men in the room took to having a go at her for that in the evening, which was quite interesting. But pretty proud to have appointed her. She's absolutely fantastic. I think one of the things I've tried to do since I've been editor is show the breadth of jobs that women can do, but also make sure that the jobs attract all kinds of women, especially from minority, ethnic and state school backgrounds. I think that's essential because we should have more diverse coverage in all kinds of ways. I'm quite fixated on who decides what is news, and how different communities, different societies, different sections of society can think news is something quite different from anyone else. And if you have a group of people who are from identical backgrounds choosing what news is, that just leads to a very boring and doesn't tell a very boring amount of news, but also doesn't tell you the full story of what's happening. So I think you need a really diverse team at every level. I've always made plain that I'm a feminist myself, obviously, and I put high expectations on anyone who's running any section, male or female, that they should feature women's voices and women's photographs and women's bylines in all their plurality.
Thank you. I'd like to just do a little bit of a compare and contrast between the media industry and the legal industry, and then come back to you, Zamila. So, Katharine, to start with you, the media, obviously, it's moment by moment, the story's got to break, things happen quickly, people have to get the content out. How hard in that environment is it to clear out of the way some of the barriers that are there for women, particularly women with family responsibilities? And so what, in your mind, are the key factors which explain why, if we had lunch, you would be the only editor having lunch with me?
I'm actually a cheap date, by the way. I was joking. It's a sandwich be fine. And I think you're right. I think there's a real structural barrier in news journalism, which isn't anyone's fault, which is the news. It happens all the time. You never know when it's going to happen, and when it happens, you have to drop anything. So if I run out, it's not because I was asked an offensive question, it's just because something's happened and I have to run out. So, it happens all the time. So I think that is a big challenge for women, particularly, or actually for anyone with any caring responsibilities. I mean, what we've tried to do at The Guardian is find ways around that. And I asked the statistics today, I was slightly amazed that 27.5% of Guardian journalists work flexibly. It's astonishing, isn't it? I think we should make more of that. And I think that helps. So that helps. As I mentioned, so the political editor is a good example. You know, the lobby in Westminster is very, very, very male-dominated. The jobs are incredibly demanding because if you're a political editor, you're basically working from the time a politician says something in the morning, the first time, till the last time any politician says something at night. So that really is a long day, and it really is a lot for one person. And so when Heather Stewart and Anushka Asthana applied, both fantastic senior journalists with small children, and the idea was they do 4 days each a week, which when you consider that we do weekends as well, that basically is one job. But two of them doing it, it meant it's sustainable, and I think it's been I'm really proud of that appointment. You know, it's a brilliant thing to do. So I think, you know, I try and do things like, you know, when women are pregnant, I try and have a conversation with them before they go to sort of reassure them that we'll be thinking about them and say, you know, I want to make sure they come back, and just, you know, share with them some experience that I've had of what seems to work and what doesn't. And I really, really love promoting women as they come back from maternity leave, which seems to happen quite a lot.
Mm-hmm. But clearly, to end up with the editor statistics that we've got now...
Oh, I'm only talking for The Guardian.
Yeah. So what, your perception of the industry overall, do they get it? Has the penny dropped?
No.
Or?
No, not at all. I think a lot of what I've said here, and in fact a lot of what I've described about The Guardian's history, would be bewildering to people in other news organisations. I mean, some of them had, you know, gender pay gaps that weren't catastrophic, but some were really terribly catastrophic, and some just there aren't any women as far as I can see. So I'd say it's a really bad industry. That's, by the way, in the sort of print, the sort of, you know, the so-called legacy organisations that do print and digital. I think some of the more digital-only areas are, there do seem to be more women represented in those areas, and more diverse generally, actually.
Right, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Now, coming to the law firm, you and I had a very interesting conversation yesterday. So, for some sections of the law firm, the work demands are, you know, quite knowable, can be, you know, scheduled a long time in advance. You yourself have been involved, for example, in litigation practices. But for other areas of the law firm, it's a bit more like the news media industry. You know, a big transaction's on. You don't know the day that that's going to start. Then the transaction team has to, you know, work to get the documents ready so that that sale or purchase or whatever can be consummated in a limited time frame. Just looking at those experiences, you know, what difference do you think it makes, that kind of work style, and where do you think the barriers are for women at the law firm, and women in law generally?
So I think the barrier starts that law firms are organisational structures that were designed by men for men, and so what we're struggling with at the moment is that we're trying to push women into those structures, and you know, my generation downwards is a new generation. I think that, you know, we're the first generation of women really to push forward with careers. My husband's the first generation of men to take equal, if not more, responsibility for the children at home. But I think that the biggest challenge really is that there's this perception that of a need to be present. So what you spoke about in your introduction, the kind of billion hours a day and the need to put your jacket on the chair to give the impression you're still in the office is still there to some degree, and that's partly a mindset issue because, you know, 80% of our partners are men who have always worked that way, and their perception is that's the only way to work. And I think the problem with the transactional teams that you mentioned is really that they don't have any other sense of how that can be done except for having women in the office or the team in the office 24 hours every day until the transaction's signed. And I actually don't think that's necessary, but I don't think people are really thinking about how else it can be done. And so one of the barriers is really a mindset that people don't think that agile working really works in a transactional context. There aren't any role models who are doing it successfully. So the people who really want to do it are worried about trying it. So I think they feel that, well, what if I don't deliver, and then that ruins it for everybody else? And so I think there's a huge pressure, and I think what we really need to do is test the perception of that actually it's not possible to do it in a different way. Ironically, I think there are some similarities with the media industry, because I think 24-hour news is something that also puts pressure on law firms, because when you are...
Sorry about that.
I definitely blame you. But I think when you're representing clients who have global interests and a news story breaks about them, the lawyers also get stuck. And so, you know, I'm leading an investigation at the moment for a client, and that's a client that's in the news constantly, and I have to be on the end of a phone no matter what time that is, and that makes it very difficult for you to plan your day and plan your childcare. And I think the more senior you are, the more financially able you are to build in contingencies around what's going on at home. So I was able at some point to afford full-time childcare, even though I didn't need it full-time. But I think when you're starting out, or even before you become a partner, that's really challenging. And people are taking much longer to make partner these days. So it's a lot longer before you've got the financial ability to really put in place the support structures if you don't have someone at home doing that for you. So I think we need to really, in the legal profession, think about the structure of our organisations very carefully and really challenge those preconceptions about why things have to be done in the traditional way.
Thank you. I worked out a long time ago the thing about leaving the jacket over the chair when I was at the law firm. It was a stunt often pulled by male article clerks who left their jacket on the chair. So you'd always say, oh, you know, Jack, you must be around here somewhere. Meanwhile, Jack's gone to the pub at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon and is having a fine old time. So I was onto that one. Zamila, having heard those two experiences, a lot of people would think to themselves, the civil service, the public sector, it doesn't have the same financial pressures, potentially not the same deadlines. So is it all fixed in the civil service?
Unfortunately not. So, I mean, I will start by explaining a little bit about my team, because my team is actually very unique in government. So several members of my team are here, and we have built a website for the Prime Minister because she asked us to. It's called Ethnicity Facts and Figures, if you do get a chance to take a look. And my head of digital are 2 women. They job share. My director is a man. I lead policy, and we are a genuinely female-heavy team. So there are definitely more women on it than men, and yet we are doing data, digital, and policy. So as a team, we're very unique, but the fact that we're female-heavy is also very unique. And we are showing government how it is possible at the centre to actually develop teams like this. And you can still deliver at pace. You can still do everything the Prime Minister wants. You are still there meeting every demand that the private office has. I mean, we have to thank technology for this as well. People can work from home. They don't have to come into the office every day. There used to be a time in the civil service where you definitely didn't have a laptop that you could take outside the building, in which case you probably did have to be in the building all the time. But now you no longer have that constraint. But outside of my team, of course not. I mean, we've never had a female cabinet secretary. We have almost 40% female permanent secretaries. So it's potentially possible at some stage that we will see this. But that is about leadership. And so the current cabinet secretary definitely in the last few years has moved this style. Because when I started working also as a child, I would often be in the room and I'd be the only woman. There was no mistaking. I would walk in, I think, I am definitely the only woman in this room. It was obvious. And in the last 10 years, that has moved quite significantly. But it depends on which part of government you're talking about. So some departments have more women than others. So definitely in education, there are more women. But if you look at the profession of policy, which I'm in, there are nowhere near as many women. And especially at very senior levels, even far fewer women. So I love this thing recently that I saw on International Women's Day. We put charts on doors of some of the buildings that said, how many women in this room for the meeting rooms? And that made people stop and think. It's true. How many of our meetings take place with all men in the room? So to your point about diversity, how are we supposed to create policies for people that improves their lives to solve problems if we're only talking to one gender at any given time? So it matters the way government works. It matters to our effectiveness if we're only talking to certain parts of our society. So better working capabilities, better leadership, but also supporting women from all sectors. This isn't just about role models. This is also about visibility. And when the woman is in the room, my God, you have to listen to her. She's not just there to hand out the coffee and everything else. So there is a presence issue as well, which is please take women seriously. And I think some things in government I've learned, we talk about women differently as well. As a woman, if you're strong and capable, you're tenacious. But if you're a guy, you're strong and capable, you're tough. And I don't understand that imbalance, so I think we need to correct that as well.
I think we should remind ourselves now of that famous photo of President Trump with his Economic Advisory Council, which was 16 men, 5 of them called Steve. Unbelievable. A chance of getting on that council if you're a man called Steve, very high. If you're a woman, 0. So there's a lesson in that. Maybe all female children should be called Stevie. That could be one potential lesson, or we might draw a few others. If we were trying to give people good advice about things that have happened in your industries that have worked to help women's equality, and things you've tried that haven't worked, so we've got to do the contrast and compare, what would you say? What's worked, what hasn't worked, or is nothing working?
No, there are some things that are working. I mean, I think the first thing that we did at Baker McKenzie when I became one of the Baker McKenzie Baker women leaders was we looked at our clients and who was making decisions, and we worked out that 35% of the key decision makers within our clients were women, and we set up a female-only client networking series of events which our clients loved because they hated networking in those awful situations where you have to go and talk about things that you really don't know and everybody knows each other and it's really awkward. And we created some networking sessions for our female clients, and our female clients gave us fantastic feedback which we then passed to our management, and they suddenly realised that actually there was a business driver around this. So I think making them understand that this is what our clients expect of us. I mean, I also had an experience where we went to a pitch and we followed in a rival law firm, which shall remain unnamed, who fielded 5 white men as the team that was pitching to our client. And they went in and 5 minutes later they were out again. And we were thinking, goodness, that didn't last very long. And when we walked in with our fairly diverse, there were a number of men and women and different ethnic backgrounds, and they said, well, thank God you've got it, because actually this is what that your previous competitor firm just didn't understand what we as the client was all about. And I think we were able to take that anecdote back and say, this is really important. Some of the other things that we've been doing that I think have had a real impact is around maternity support for our colleagues. So we have quite an elaborate maternity programme where prior to going off on maternity leave, we have a series of coaching sessions. Our maternity leavers write a business plan. They look at, they write a list of their client relationships. They have keeping in touch days that they're allowed to use, so we plan coming back for client events and training events to keep in touch. And then they have some coaching when they come back. And we look at that list and we say, well, what client relationships did you have when you left? If there's no good reason why you shouldn't get those back, you're straight back into those teams. So I think helping them hit the ground running on their return, because we saw a really difficult ramping up period. Some of the other things that have worked are we've really educated our evaluation committees and financial compensation committees to understand the impact of maternity leave on financial performance and billable hour targets and the like. So they make allowances for the fact that people have been out of the business. Clearly, agile working, we've had a Be Agile policy for the last 2 years, and that has been a real game changer, because the vast majority of our business now understands that you can work from home if you need to pick up the kids or if you need to let the plumber in or whatever it may be. And that's been something that not just women but everyone has found transformational in balancing some of the challenges of the quite tricky work-life balance that the legal profession throws at you from time to time. I think the things that aren't really working are we have a problem with what we call the cliff. That's not cliff, that's the cliff. And the cliff is that we start out with 50-50 graduates, male, female, and then by the time we get to the 6-year qualified point, we're at 70-30, and therefore the pipeline for partnership is diminishing, and we've been doing a bit of thinking around why that is. And in fact, today we had some research findings come back around why women tend to leave our firm at that point. And there's a whole myriad of reasons, but lack of role models is a really prominent one. So, and also a lack of understanding about what the attraction of being a partner is. So they see, I suppose, the pressures that they perceive partners have. And I think we as partners don't necessarily talk about the benefits of partnership and the additional control that gives you. So I think there's a kind of coyness around the profession that, you know, don't talk about partnership because it's probably about money, and we're a bit sensitive about being really transparent about what the career path is and what the benefits are of keeping in there and becoming a partner. And I think the other thing is we need to have more men really vocalising support. One of my litigation partners told me a story of he was in a meeting with one of our junior female associates with a number of barristers and different law firms just after Christmas, and they were talking about choosing an expert for a case, and they were chatting about this expert's expertise and things that they'd done in the past. And the most senior QC in the room said, "Oh, we have to have her, she's got great tits." Oh. And my colleague, as the male partner, said, "Actually, I don't think that's a relevant factor. You know, that's very inappropriate." And I think it takes men to speak out. The women in the room, I think, were so taken aback that this is what they were hearing. And it made a real impact, I think, for him to support the females in the room. So I think we need to see more of that, men speaking up and calling out bad behaviour.
Wow. Thank you. I think that's made an impression on me and the audience. Zamila, is there a cliff in the civil service where you see lots of women and then they fall off the cliff? Yeah. And what do you think's working or not working?
I think it's a good point, actually. So I don't know what the ratio is, but we definitely have more generous packages for women, in that we do see women take their maternity leave. Whether they're coming back into the same role before they left, that I don't know. So I should look into that. But in terms of what is working, so the civil service is quite unique in that we have set targets for diversity. We have targets for ethnic minorities, senior leaders, we have targets for disabled persons, we have targets for more women on boards. Because we've said, listen, there's no way we're going to achieve leadership unless we actually have a number that we think we're going to aim at. And the number is derived from actually looking at our population size, our workforce size, what education stats we have, and then saying this is a credible number that we have to make progressive. So we might set a target, and then in a few years we might have to set another target as the numbers start to come through. But it's not just about the number, you then have to create the support network that's going to make that thing possible. So we do also have teams that are there to support people coming through the system. We also have programs supporting people coming through the system. But I think where the challenge becomes is, at what point does it start to become quite woolly? And when do women not know when they're supposed to ask for help? Or when do the men step up, as I said earlier, and say, this is something that we have to take the onus on as well. So one thing I think is wonderful in the civil service is most government departments have creches. I don't know how many organizations do that, but in government department, you will find a creche. So men and women can bring their kids in the morning and then take them home later in the day. And luckily, we're right on the border of St. James's Park, so that's quite a nice place to be for kids. But it's also nice to see children in the working environment. So that makes that place just healthy for people. But also, we need our male leaders to actually start talking about diversity of thought. And I think that is where the change is going to come. And we don't often hear that. You'll hear it only in the equality space, or as I said, in the human resources space. But women take risks differently. And we know this from the financial crash. Christine Lagarde made this point very well, which was maybe we wouldn't have had a crash if there were more women in senior roles, because we think about things differently. That doesn't mean we think better, it just means we think differently. So if we approach risk differently, you're going to manage risk differently. I don't yet hear that conversation enough, so I would like that to come through. But also the other thing is, so I take your point on networking. We definitely do not encourage more women to network. And when we do, we suggest they network with other women. I want women to network with everybody, because again, if we take the diversity of thought point, we should be networking with everybody. Opportunities arise that way, better communications arrive that way, long-term relationships arrive that way. So I would like women, if you have the time, if you don't have the caring responsibilities, to be encouraged to be able to network. And if you do have the responsibilities, then we need to find a way to get around that. Why does all networking have to happen in the evening? It can happen during the day too, it's pretty effective. So I think those things that allow for opportunities to be possible also have to be addressed.
And is there a consciousness, do you think, that it's somewhat odd that the absolute head of the civil service has never been a woman when this is a nation that has got a female Prime Minister, has had a female Prime Minister in the past, but you haven't achieved it at the civil service level. Do people think about it like that? Do they talk about it like that?
I think it's not yet prominent it's noticeable, obviously, but because we have about 40% permanent secretaries who are women, I don't think that we're that far off anymore. So it's more realistic now to be able to say it's very likely we will see in our lifetimes a female cabinet secretary. But the fact that it hasn't happened today has to be concerning to us, because women have always been in the civil service. We've actually had senior leaders for a long time, not at any given scale that is appropriate, but definitely they've been there. But then we have to figure out what the barriers were always there, in terms of why did the cabinet secretary always have to be a man? Why does the person the Prime Minister trusts always have to be a man? That's maybe a conversation that's still to be had, so yeah.
Katharine, I'd like to move the conversation to perceptions of women when they are leaders. So we know that women leaders are perceived differently, that there's a lot of focus on their appearance, on their family structures. There's very good psychological research now that we are, a bit wired to correlate leadership and likeability in a man. We see him commanding and acting, and that fits with our stereotypes. When we see a woman who's commanding and leading, we're pretty predisposed to conclude that she's sort of tough, hard-bitten, probably not very likeable. Have you felt those stereotypes play out around your own leadership at The Guardian? And then more broadly, how do they play out in the news media today? If Theresa May went to an event and heard a tragic story and became very emotionally engaged in it and actually was tearful, is tomorrow's headline, "Tearful Theresa can't take the pressure," or is tomorrow's headline, Prime Minister shows great care for, Fred or Susie who's got a problem? Yeah. How do you weigh that up when you're headline writing?
Yeah. Well, it depends what she's crying about.
Right.
I think the context is really important, but there's no question that what you're saying is true. And I have to say, obviously, because I lived in Australia when you were Prime Minister, I think particularly what you faced was so extreme and such a kind of warning to other women to don't even think you can try and do what Julia Gillard is doing, because look what we're going to do to you. And I think it's a pretty startling thing and a pretty shaming thing for our societies. And it's something I think about the feeling that if women get power, then a man must have lost power. And then who am I as a man, And I think obviously not all men are like that by any means, but I think it's a really powerful thing, and it's quite recent, isn't it? I mean, it's quite recent that any of us would be having these conversations. That's what I kind of reassure myself. I mean, I think one of the things that I've been particularly involved with is looking at is online abuse of women. When I became editor, I commissioned a report into the comments left on the Guardian website. So we have this very open structure where everyone can comment, and there were 70 million comments left on the Guardian since 2006, and we had a systematic data examination of them, and we found that of the 10 most abused writers, and when we say abused, what we did, we said that if a comment had to be removed, we would say it was probably abusive. So it's a proxy, it's not. Anyway, of the 10 most abused writers, 8 were women, and the 2 men were black. So there was not one white man in the top 10, and so it was such a kind of clear, objective analysis of what happens. And so, the way we responded to that was we decided to open far fewer conversations. If there's a problematic subject, there'll just be one place to have the debate on the Guardian website. It's really changed the conversations. They're much better, and our writers get much less abuse. But I think when the internet sort of when people started, it became more open and people were commenting much more. Women were just told for years they just sort of had to suck it up. Really, that's what life was like. And I think one of the things that's sad about how the last 15 years of the web that we can see, and those of us who can remember what it was like at the beginning, was this sense that there were going to be these wonderful town squares, we could all have these wonderful conversations and solve the problems of the world, and it's just going to be great. And I always remember I interviewed Gordon Brown at the time. I think he was Prime Minister at the time, and he said, I'm not sure Rwanda could happen again because of social media. And that was the mood of the time, you know, there's going to be no more wars. And now look, and and I think, you know, and what we find is that it's almost like the internet has facilitated so much of what's the worst of us at the moment, and that's what we're seeing at the moment. And, you know, I can't, one of the things I wondered when I was living in Australia when you were Prime Minister, well, whether that level of abuse would not have happened if this sort of hadn't been unlocked in a social media sense.
Well, my experience is people are almost never rude or aggressive to you face to face. I could count on the finger of one hand across all of my years in public life, not just as Prime Minister, but as Deputy Prime Minister, Deputy Opposition Leader, you know, a backbencher who used to stand at train stations handing out leaflets. I could count on the fingers of one hand the number of times people have come up and been physically, you know, in my face and rude to me. But the look online is quite a different one.
Yes, I mean there's a great genre of news article where someone who's been very much abused by a troll. The best one was by Lindy West. Has been abused by a troll. They go and track the troll down. And the trolls are universally, I promise you, I've read loads of these articles, and the trolls are universally devastated, upset. I didn't mean to upset you. And you go, well, you call me a fat bitch every day for 5 years. You think I'm not going to be upset? I think you're a real person, and I think there's something about the disengagement of the web that has sort of coarsened how we speak to each other.
I do recall as we rolled out our national broadband network policy in Australia, which was to create, faster internet right around the country. The Northern Territory News, the newspaper in Darwin, went with the headline, "Faster, cheaper porn." So there are issues about how we see the online environment. Zamila and Joanna, you were having a fantastic conversation before we came on about perceptions in the workplace, about images of leadership and women's leadership, times where you've been mistaken for the junior instead of the leader. Where do you think we are with perceptions of women leadership in the law? Do young lawyers get told better off to work for him because she's really nasty? Does that happen, or do you see those sort of biases playing out, or not so much?
I don't think so much. I mean, I think actually a lot of the more junior colleagues actually find having women leaders really refreshing, because we tend to be a lot more chatty about what's going on in the workplace, and they get to know a lot more from us than some of our male colleagues. We're probably, there's less of a hierarchical difference between the partners and the associates in the team. I think in general terms, the women leaders tend to be much more egalitarian, much more inclusive in the way that they go about it. But I think there's still that general societal perception that the man is probably the more senior. And I was explaining earlier that one of my, last year Baker McKenzie launched their own internal He for She campaign, and we had a series of blogs and video footage of our colleagues, male colleagues, who were talking about what we called their click moment, when they realised that there was a challenge with gender equality. And for one of my colleagues, male colleagues, who was my trainee, his click moment was that he and I had gone to a meeting, and we walked through the door, and the client shook his hand and assumed that he was the partner and that I was the trainee. And for him, that was the moment where he realised, actually, there's something going on here. But I think that actually women are often quite hard on women. I've had more challenges with my fellow female partners than I have with my male partners, I think, in terms of unfairness around things that, you know, decisions that I've made or things that I've done. And I think women are quite tough on women, and that has to change too. I think we must be much more supportive of one another and not try to do one another down. And I think perhaps that comes from there being fewer women, so there's a greater sense of competition among them than there is perhaps among the guys, who have a much more convivial relationship in general terms. So people being criticised for how much maternity leave they took, so whether it's too long or whether it's too short, and are they a bad mother because they worked full time when they came back from maternity leave. And I don't hear any of the men being criticised for not taking paternity leave or taking it and not being committed to the business. So I think there are some challenges still, but...
And Zamila, you spoke to some of those perception issues going into meetings where it's assumed that you're the personal assistant. Across the public sector, how do you think these perceptions of women leaders play out?
I think it's a really good point. I mean, we, as part of building this website, I mentioned that my head of digital is a woman, and I have 2 women now who lead this. But the first time we had to give a demonstration of this website, my director is a man, I went to this meeting, and my digital lead as well, and everyone looked to the director, and he said, don't look at me, she built the website. She's about to give the demonstration. And it was just a very interesting thing of a room of about 30-odd people who were just looking at the white guy and saying, you're definitely the one that's going to do the digital, that's going to tell me how this website works. And we went, no, we know nothing about it. She knows everything. And at the same time, most of my quants are women. And so whenever I go to a meeting, and if there are men in the room, I have to say, the quant is going to talk to you, and she's sitting next to me, and she's here. And so we do need to get over this thing of, technology is not only about men. Certain sectors are not only about men. Ethnic minorities are not only here to give you tea and coffee. We have to find a way of dealing with our own perceptions. And then when it happens, we have to call it out. Because otherwise, how else are we going to change our behaviors? People may be doing this completely innocuously, completely unintentionally, but nevertheless, it hurts when it happens, and it affects your confidence, and it matters to how it is you see yourself. But also, if this person is doing it to you, they might be doing it to countless other people. So we've got to find a way to call it out in a polite way and say, listen, please don't do this again. It damn well hurts, and you could be doing this to somebody that is far less strong than I am and not capable of dealing with it. But at the same time, say it in a room full of other people so they can also see, God, bloody hell, I better not do that again either. So I don't think yet we found a way to talk about this openly. We might find a one-to-one chat, or we might go cry in a corner about it. But I would love to see the day where we actually say, no, Minister, you actually did something really wrong there. And I'm just going to correct you so that you don't do it again. And I'm sure you'll appreciate it. So I'd love to see that happen.
It's very non-British, though, isn't it, to do that? And I wonder whether that's a difference. You were talking about the perceptions earlier of certain countries being more advanced and others being behind, but is that directness of approach something to a driver of those differences, do you think?
I think it's very possible. I mean, I am Indian. We also are very direct as people. But I have worked in the Middle East. I have worked in Sudan. I have worked in Nepal. People are very blunt about problems when you are facing adversity at those levels. When in conflict countries, you just get to it and you're very clear about it. But I don't know that in the global north we should suddenly assume that we have the answers to everything, although we fixed everything. So because we have equality laws, absolutely we should celebrate those things. But that doesn't mean we are devoid of being able to talk about this. So as I said earlier, why did it take an act to say we should now talk about what women are being paid? Why have we not always been talking about this? I just don't understand. So I don't know that issues should be off limits. So whether it's polite or impolite, we have to find a way to deal with this. So forcing a conversation is not the worst thing in the world if you both benefit. So that's the perception I take away, which is, even if I force this, I promise you will both benefit from the outcome.
And I think that's why it's so important that we engage men in this conversation as well, because actually I've been forcing those conversations for a long time, and I get the impression that sometimes people think, oh God, not her again. Okay, what's she going to say this time? And actually it's
so what though? So what if they think
well,
that?
So what? But it does discourage you from doing it again, because you think, oh, shall I say something?
I remember when I started at The Guardian, I was just this kind of bolshy young, as I've said before, feminist, and there was one amazing moment in conference when Paul Johnson, who's my deputy now, I went in and he said, before you say anything, Kath, we've noticed the caption on page 19, and the sub-responsible has been sent to a correctional facility. And I obviously hadn't noticed, and it was just some sexist caption. But so I think I'd obviously complained so often that they were like getting their excuses in early, and so that's why I thought, well, actually, I'm just going to keep going because it's obviously working,
And it's important to do that, but I think it's also very helpful when those comments come from the men, and then actually people start, and the other men in the room start listening a bit more, I think. So.
Well, it did come from him, I guess.
Yes,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, a correctional facility, interesting. We're talking here about having the conversation, so what we're going to do now is have the conversation with you. There's an opportunity for audience questions. We have people with microphones who are going to run up and down. We've been speculating in the office that maybe microphone delivery could be a Commonwealth Games event, in which case we've got participants ready to go. So yes, the woman here in the black coat on the aisle.
Hi everyone, thank you for such a fantastic talk. If you can't tell, I'm from Australia as well. I'm just in London to do research on the media, looking at women prime ministers and their media representation. I look at Thatcher and Theresa May, Julia Gillard, and two women from New Zealand. And what I've found so far is that in comparison, like with Theresa May and Margaret Thatcher, the media is actually getting worse in the way that they gender them. So it's getting more gendered. They're talking about their parent, like May's appearance more than Thatcher's. They're talking about her family more than Thatcher's. And so it seems that even though we've had 30, 40 years of feminism, and I feel like feminism now is even more mainstream than it used to be in the 70s, we are still having this massive rise of media sexism. The Guardian's good though. I've analysed you guys. You guys are good. I like reading The Guardian. It is a trend in the conservative press. So my question is, and I know this has a massive impact on women and bystander sexism and how we see ourselves and our leadership roles. So how can we improve this? What can the media do? Like, should we impose laws? Like, what is the answer, basically?
Okay, what is the answer? One little part of the answer is please make yourself known to Laura, who's at the back, before we conclude tonight, because we should get your contact details and you could blog for us on some of that research. But Kath?
And Julia Baird's written some interesting stuff on this, I think. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, it's really interesting what you say, that it's got worse. I feel that, so I'm interested that you've researched that and you can sort of prove it. I think, although feminism is mainstream, I wouldn't say the situation for women in all ways has got better by any means. And I think, particularly, this kind of media scrutiny and what I was talking about, this sort of social media atmosphere has really changed a lot. I mean, that's not just to blame technology. I think there is a kind of, women's personal lives, actually maybe everyone's personal lives are more up for grabs than they ever used to be. And, when Thatcher was in power, there weren't magazines that sort of circled a funny knee or a fat ankle or whatever. They didn't exist. And so she was at least able to, just be known for her handbag rather than anything else, So I think I'm not surprised to hear you say it. It's very depressing, and a solution. Julia.
Well, I think part of the solution and part of what we want to do at the Institute is to, call it out and shine a light on it. I think, it is the sort of boiled frog metaphor in many ways, isn't it? When it's just happening and happening and happening. Unless you do shine a light on it, then people won't see it and won't react to it. I'm enough of an optimist to think that if we do shine a light on it, then over time, people will correct the behaviours.
Yeah, and more women editors, obviously, not to be too self-serving. But I think the thing is, just to say it's just about the media is really to miss the point, because it's a big societal issue. So just to blame the media isn't enough.
Thank you. Now, have you still got the microphone? No, okay. I was going to get you to, if we can just hand a microphone over to the gentleman just one row in front, and then I'll come over to some of the hands over there.
Hi. Thank you. Kind of continuing on from the last theme of the panel discussion, it seems like so much of the progress which has been made either as a result of strong women in power or legislative imposition or kind of a mentor in the workforce, but it still kind of is based in this assumption that women will be primary caregivers, and therefore that's the barrier for them continuing on in the workforce without men kind of stepping up and taking responsibility for childhood or imposing like flexible working policies. It doesn't really seem like change will be all forthcoming. I'm wondering, in your kind of experience of kind of talking about gender issues over the years, have you seen kind of much appetite for change within like men's circles, because basically it's the men who are the gatekeepers for these changes.
I think that's a really good point, and it came strongly out at our launch conversation too, that unless we're changing dynamics at home about caregiving and domestic labour, then you're only dealing with one side of the equation. I'm not saying I've got the answers, but Joanna might.
So, well, I'm not sure I necessarily have all the answers, but I think that I've certainly perceived there to have been a really material shift. So when my husband and I had children, he absolutely wanted to play his part, and we both worked full time, and yet I was still the primary caregiver, not because he wasn't up for it, but because he worked in the city and his colleagues were not up for the man taking that role. That society did not support him taking more of a responsibility. So that was why I ended up stepping back a bit and going part-time. I don't think the next generation, the generation of my team that I see coming up is going to swallow that at all. I mean, I see that this is no longer a gender issue. This is a generational issue, actually. I mean, my colleagues who are younger all want to play a part in the raising of their family, or if they don't have a family, they want to play a part in having a decent work-life balance. And so for them, these conversations around flexible and agile working, shared parental leave are all really, really important to them. And I think that your generation is going to drive a huge change, because society is going to accept and expect that parents take equal responsibility for domestic duties, people take equal responsibility for caring duties of elderly parents. And so this is no longer going to be a female issue, and I really expect it to change quite dramatically over the next 5 to 10 years.
I mean, I've noticed a real change at The Guardian. With this new, that you can share parental leave now. It's not maternity leave, and just loads of younger male colleagues are doing it, and then they sometimes want to come back part-time. And I've noticed as well men applying for for time off for caring responsibilities, not for children but for elderly relatives and stuff. So I have really noticed a shift. As I say, The Guardian is a bit different from other places in the media, but I have noticed change. I mean, it's nothing like what it needs to be, though.
So I'm just wondering, though, I mean, so I take the point that things are changing and it's positive, but I just wondered, through the publication of the gender pay gap last week, when we find out how much more men are being paid than women, is that going to have a negative effect, which is to say, wait a minute, why should I, as the man, take the leave when I know I'm the biggest earner compared to my partner? So that is going to have to, we don't want to have knock-on effects by having more open data and just showing what it is women aren't being paid. So we're going to have this conversation in tandem, because otherwise it would skew the maternity numbers and the shared leave stats as well. So publishing data is a good thing. Changing behaviors is what's necessary. So, I mean, the point earlier about do we need more legislation, we actually have some of the best equality laws in the world in the UK. And yet we are still having this debate about where we are at for gender, for disability, for ethnicity. So it's about the fact that when we change legislation, we have to do something very serious to change behaviors. And that is still not yet at the fruition and stats that we need to see. So that's yet to turn the dial.
I agree with that, but I think I'm seeing in my workplace many more male role models talking about, leaving early to go to see their kids' school play, or taking time out because they're waiting in for the plumber rather than their wife who's got an important business meeting, and I think actually having those role models then really empowers more junior colleagues to say, actually, I can do that too, and it's not going to impact my career. So I definitely think things are really changing in that respect.
And Zamila, just when we're on the gender pay data, you had an interesting look at the difference between perceptions and reality around gender pay. Can you share that with us?
I mean, one of the most alarming articles I read last week, so in addition to just learning about how much more men were being paid than women across sectors, what was very interesting to me was in some of the areas where the biggest gaps existed, the surveys of women in those areas said, so this is before the data came out, women had said that there's a survey that says women who think that their environment is female friendly. So some of the areas that had the highest pay gap were where women had perceived that these areas were better for women than men. So it suggests we are not yet adept at looking at what the issues genuinely are that are causing the disparities. We think we are in equal environments, and yet suddenly we get this data that tells us you are nowhere near parity.
I mean, the other thing about the data that was so shocking, I think, was not just the pay gap, but it's the top quartile. I mean, even in companies with quite small pay gaps, the top quartile, which is the top 25% most highly paid people in the company, overwhelmingly men, even in companies with low pay gaps.
Precisely.
And I think, I mean, that is just as much as anything, you know, a legacy, isn't it, of years of they're just being men.
Men.
But the rate of change, not what we would want to see.
No.
Now, there was a forest of hands sort of towards that pillar. So if we can give the microphone to the lady with the blonde hair, and then perhaps she could hand it to the man next to her after asking her question.
Hi, thank you so much for just having this forum here. It's been very encouraging, actually. My question is directly for Julia. I lived in Australia while you were Prime Minister and Deputy and pretty much a lot of your political career. And I wonder if you could talk to your famous misogyny speech. Because I just thought that was... I saw the coverage at the time. I worked for the national news broadcaster, and so I was very aware of the unkind commentary and the things that you dealt with, which we'd never seen before. So given the conversation tonight, I wonder if you could talk to that.
Sure, I'm happy to talk to that, and just whilst we're on some news media issues, for all of the things said about that speech now, it was not well received in Australian politics by the parliamentary press gallery, who thought it was a huge error and huge mistake and would alienate male voters and so on and so forth. So it was a speech given in a very particular political context, you know, where I thought I was going to a question time where I'd be questioned about having supported a particular man to be Speaker of the House of Representatives, and it's subsequently emerging that he'd authored some very sexist text messages, not something I could have known at the time, that I supported his appointment. As it was, he was, you know, in his office contemplating his resignation, and I knew that. But I expected it to be a ferocious question time around sexism and gender questions. And I think, you know, I got ready for that with a rising sense of the injustice that after everything that had happened, including the media coverage, the political jibing, the stuff that routinely happened in question time, that now it would be me who was apparently under the spotlight on sexism rather than, you know, the world around me. So I think you saw that play a fair bit into the speech. And, you know, I mean, the whole thing of speeches, I'm going to sound like I'm, you know, as old as the hills now, but the whole thing about speeches going viral and getting global reactions and all the rest of it sort of instantaneously was still relatively new in the world, and so I had no, you know, wouldn't have even occurred to me to think this speech is going to end up reported in, you know, Huffington Post in the US or something like that. It would never even have occurred to me to think that, but of course in our interlinked world that happened very quickly. And one of the sort of, in some ways, I've had mixed views about that speech, in the sense that when you spend as long in politics as I did and you sort of travel the world and you get asked about the 120 minutes the whole time, there was a kind of little part of me that thought, oh, you know, it's all come down to this, and did all these other things. But now I'm kind of at peace with it, because I do go around the world now, and, you know, I will literally be walking down a street and a woman on the other side of the road, and I could be in, you know, New Delhi, I could be in New York, I could be in London, I could be in Berlin, I could be anywhere, I could be in Kenya, and she'll cross a road, almost getting killed, to come up and talk to me about that speech. And when you have the conversation, you know, often she doesn't know anything about Australia other than the most basic, you know, kangaroo kind of stuff. And certainly the only thing she knows about Australian politics is that speech. And so I'm at peace on the basis that if, you know, the only thing these women are going to know about Australia, apart from kangaroos and koalas, is that speech. There's not a bad result.
We used to do impressions of it in the office.
Of my speech?
Yeah.
Oh.
I will not take accusations of misogyny from that man. I will not. We did it all the time.
Well done.
Even got the hand movement.
Right, got the hand movement. So I'm very impressed. I went to the Guardian yesterday. I'm going to have to go back and have I could judge a competition as to who's got it best. If you can hand the microphone to the gentleman sitting next to you, and then I'm going to come over here.
Cheers, thank you. G'day, my name is Brody. I'm an exchange student from Australia. It seems like there's quite a few of us out here tonight, so I'm glad we are having good representation. On the back of that question, I'd be really interested in seeing what politics could do to support women who are supporting their family, for example. We've seen Larissa Waters, she was breastfeeding in Parliament last year, and New Zealand's Prime Minister is set to give birth in October this year. So I'd be really interested in asking the panel, considering politics is where our country's leaders are sitting, what can it do to lead the way in supporting women in the workplace? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. I'm actually going to, I'm going to invite everybody to say something, but I'm going to start with Kath. How should the New Zealand media report the story about the Prime Minister's baby, and how will they?
It's really interesting. From a distance, it looks to me that, Jacinda Ardern is obviously playing it brilliantly. She's obviously a very appealing politician, and it looks to me like everyone's playing nice for now. And I guess my concern is what happens later. If she is in some way unavailable when something happens. I know she said her partner's going to be the chief carer and so on, but I'm worried about what happens after. It could be the New Zealand media environment is milder than others. It could be, but let's see. I'm worried about it.
I think another dimension of that will not just be the one time she's unavailable. I think it's you only get a limited time in politics to do your stuff and tell your story, and by the time she's presenting at the next election, how much airtime will have been taken by her pregnancy, her baby, all of the celebrity stuff that will come with, sort of celebrity style interest in the baby. What's the baby going to be named? All of that compared with things I'm sure she would be trying to do in, healthcare and education and a future for all New Zealanders. There'll be some trade-off questions there. How do you think that will compare and contrast with how Tony and Cherie Blair's baby, Leo was born when Tony was Prime Minister. What do you think the difference will be?
Yeah, it's entirely different. I think Jacinda Ardern is only the second woman after Benazir Bhutto to give birth while Prime Minister. And I think, there were lots of smutty jokes, I seem to remember, around Tony and Cherie Blair, because it had happened at Balmoral. Why do I remember this?
Happened at Balmoral.
Do not remember the details. Let's not. But we do seem to
make it sound like you were there.
I know. I feel like I was. It was Cherie's issue, and the issue I think she was 45 or something like that. So the issue was she was older and stuff like that. It was never that Tony Blair was older. It was always that Cherie was older, and it was can she handle it? It seemed to be quite an appealing thing. There was a young baby in number 10 that seemed a sort of humanising thing for Tony Blair. And I think that's one of the things you talked about men leaving early. You'd often see men going, "Oh, I'm going to the school play," and a woman goes to going to the school play, and they go, "Oh, she's leaving early again." I think there has to be careful about that. So I think that's.
I think David Cameron had the same effect when he moved into Downing Street with his kids, and it was all about, oh, isn't he a great dad? He can just go from the cabinet meeting over to the kitchen and play a part in family life, and yet had it been Samantha who was in the prime ministerial position, no doubt she would have been criticised for not spending enough time doing important country business, or conversely, is she spending enough time with her kids because she's clearly distracted by doing X, Y and Z. So I do think that to your question earlier around are women leaders treated differently, that's undoubtedly the case.
I just wanted to raise sort of the flip side of this, which is female politicians also get a lot of flack for not having children. And it's incredible how much negative press comes out about this. And Nicola Sturgeon had to write a very personal article in the papers just to say, look, this is why I don't have kids. This is my life story. Why that had to be the case, to be able to share something so personal, I have no idea, and I don't know why it was ever had to be justified. But the same thing happened to Theresa May. She got a lot of negative press for not having children. Whose business is it, if anybody's, if a woman chooses not to have children for whatever reason? And so it's, you can't win whether you have kids or you don't have kids.
Yeah,
this is going to be an issue.
Woman,
but I don't know anyone ever asking Ted Heath, why don't you have kids? Was that ever a thing that was as big? I mean, since his death, we've talked about it, but it's just, we have this debate of both sides, and I think both have really ugly consequences, and we do need to call it out, because politicians have other things to be doing, I think. So constantly having to talk about this against their will, I
just have to sort of symbolise something as well with the way you live your life rather than the policies you enact.
If we could, lady here with the leather jacket on the side.
Hi, thank you. My name's Jessie. I'm the candidate for the Women's Equality Party in the current elections in Bethnal Green. Tower Hamlets has the highest child poverty in the country. We have 54% child poverty. And so the issue of childcare is a big one. If families in Tower Hamlets want to rise out of poverty, they need to work. But they can't access public childcare at the moment because of government cuts and because of local government cuts. And I want to put a question to everyone on the panel. From a corporate perspective and a political perspective, who should be providing the childcare to help families like those in Tower Hamlets get work and rise out of poverty?
Well, I don't know much about the British system of childcare subsidies and support, but in Australia we always took the perspective that childcare was associated with employment, and therefore there was a means tested, it didn't go endlessly up, but there was a tax benefit that came with using childcare, so to enable you to use childcare, so correlated with work. But separate to that, a cost subsidy system, the childcare rebate, which was available for women in work and also in some circumstances women who weren't working. So a recognition that people needed access to childcare potentially to look for work or for other reasons. So it was a mixed tax subsidy arrangement. But obviously different countries solve these problems differently. I don't know, do you have a perspective on the...
I can speak a little bit to this because, of course, Tower Hamlets is data on our website. Tower Hamlets has one of the highest ethnic minority populations in the UK by just geography, and it's specific to an ethnic group, actually. There's multiple issues at play here. One is just London. The cost of childcare in London is much higher than anywhere else in the country. Some ethnic groups have more children than other groups, and therefore, proportionally, the cost is going to be higher for you. And the rollout of the new policies haven't yet completely taken effect. So in the UK now, you can get up to 30 hours of free childcare for, I think it's up to 2 children or more. So, but it has to be implemented effectively. So there's a combination of social mobility issues, proximity in just geography and the cost in London, and then higher numbers of children. So all of that is going to have multiple knock-on effects. But nevertheless, we do need to look at this because it turns out Bangladeshi kids in school actually do very well now compared to about 10 years ago. So the girls do much better than the boys in school. So if we want more diverse workforces, we're going to have to help these people into the labour market. And so we do have to solve this childcare problem.
Thank you. I'm going to take a question just behind you, Rachel, yes. And then I'm only going to be able to take one more, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Thanks. I'm Benita Metapalma. I'm British, and I run a centre-right equality think tank called Modern Britain. And I just wanted to pick up on a couple of points. So one being the whole directness of a British person point. And I'm very acutely aware that I'm often banging on about equality, diversity, and being a strong feminist myself. And I think, obviously I'm Indian origin, so maybe it's my direct thing coming out there, but I wonder how we can change that culture, because I do think that's the big barrier that comes into play here. I also wanted to pick up on intersectionality, because I don't think that was explored that much, and I hope it will be a focus for the Institute. But given it's one of the last questions, I also thought you were all incredible, inspirational panelists. I wondered what you guys would say for future women leaders in each of your fields, because I'd love to follow in some of your fields, and I think that would be really valuable for the whole room.
Okay, we're gonna hold that second question until the wrap up, but thank you for it. Are the British too polite? I mean, I'm Australian. We're not very polite. We're known for being, sort of pretty blunt.
I think the British are too polite, and I think women are too polite also, because I think there's a sense that you don't, well, certainly I spent a lot of my career thinking I better not say this because I don't really know how it's going to be received and whether that will have an impact on me. And I think that increases the fear. So I think partly the reason that that's happened to me in my career is that I was a minority in most conversations. And I think if we can be brave enough to speak up, you find that a lot of people share your views, whether male or female. So I think the current climate of lots of open discussion around #MeToo and all the, dignity conversations that we're having at the moment give us a great platform to have this conversation really openly. And what's been very interesting since I've been braver about talking about things is how much of an affinity I have with male colleagues around the same issues. So it's made me realise that I'm not as alone as I thought I was to speak up. And the more we normalise these conversations, the less of an issue it's going to be. So I think it's really important that we stop being so British about it, and we start being more Aussie about the whole approach. Or we make it British, exactly.
And on intersectionality, we are absolutely intending to look at intersectionality questions. So once again, if you could forge a link with Laura, who's over there, that's something that we will want to be dealing with, so it'd be great to have your contacts. I'm going to pick the one last question. Oh, it's so hard. I'll pick the lady here. Yes, you with the lady with her black jumper on. I think you've got all black. Yes, you. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Indonesian, and right now my research is looking at political sophistication in Southeast Asia, and from my findings, it seems that women are about 50% less likely to be able to define even democracy, let alone participate in politics effectively. So what I'm wondering is, Global Institute for Women's Leadership, how global is it going to be? And how would this institute help promote gender equality in developing nations?
Okay. I think I probably should take that one. Our aim is to bring together what is already known, the current evidence base, to deepen the evidence base about what works for women's leadership, to create women leaders, and also to have their leadership fairly evaluated. And we want then to be translating that research into action as broadly around the world as we possibly can, by forging the widest possible set of links and by linking into the activist community who can then popularise these solutions. So yes, it's our intention to be truly global. Whilst Southeast Asia and Indonesia are a long way from here, they're actually pretty close to Australia, which is where I live, and so we'll be, keen. And if you've got any suggestions for contacts and outreach in that region of the world, all ears and open to it. Obviously, that's my home region of the world, so I've got a set of contacts built up over time in politics and beyond. So yes, we want it to be truly global. Coming back in some ways to the intersectionality point, we're not underestimating the complexity of that, but the global statistics are telling us that we need to see change everywhere. We're now going to come back to the panel for a last wrap-up comment. I said last week when we did the launch that, in my view, we are seeing another wave of feminism gathering. That you can see it in the amount of discussion about gender, you can see it in Me Too and Time's Up, you can see it in the reactions to things like the gender pay gap statistics here, you can see it in that even the fashion industry and others are, popularising feminist slogans. I think there's another wave gathering. Is there that momentum? How should we capture it? What's the outlook for the future? And to answer your question, getting to where you got to today, what's a lesson you would hand over to the coming generation? We'll just sweep around the panel, please.
My wish for this moment, I agree with you, there is a moment, but moments can become a movement or they can dissipate. So my wish is that it is truly intersectional. I'm glad that word came up, that issues of class, race, sexuality and disability are taken into account, as well as gender. I think in that moment, it's true in all moments, but I think particularly in that moment, that women in leadership positions, there's a great African-American phrase, we should lift as we climb. We can't just get to the top and say, isn't this marvellous? So much has been achieved for women because of me. You have to then you need to show, not just be a role model, you need to bring other women up and make that as diverse as possible. I also think one of my worries about this current feminist moment is that it's quite an individualistic moment, and I think less will be achieved if that continues than if we kind of work like in a collective way, think of ourselves as a group of women, or as a society, and so we can do it, but we can only do it if we all work together.
So I actually agree with a lot of that. I think this is a moment that we shouldn't waste, because perceptions could then mask a lot of what we think and how we take this forward. So I love the idea that there's this new institute, because we haven't had one for a long time. This debate has not happened for a long time. I think social media will help drive this in some ways that maybe was never possible before, but it'll help keep the noise up. But I think the perception issue, we do need to watch that, because otherwise we'll stop challenging, we'll stop pushing, because at some point we'll think, okay, we made it again. And then we'll have to wait for another generation to tell us, no, we're not there yet. So I think the noise has to be maintained, and the way to do that is to constantly challenge and to ask men, what are you doing? I don't want to only be women on panels. I mean, we have to start this way, because that's the right way to do it. But the next step forward has to be, now men, you tell us. I want an all-men panel talking about women. So if we push this and we challenge it that way, that is what an institute can genuinely achieve. But harnessing noise is a good thing to do, and it makes politicians stand up, it makes business leaders stand up, because you think, what's the legal imperative, what's the business imperative, what's the people imperative, and all of that is going to matter to all of us. So I think humanizing it a little bit as well makes it not just about one gender, but about all genders, and intersectionality, and every other group, because if women can do this, then we can take persons with other inequality challenges with us, because we'll say, this is what we learned, this is what the bridge is going to have to overcome. But we can only do that if we have a better conversation about it. So one thing I always say to my bosses the day I start, because all of my bosses are generally men, I'll say, I think the greatest quality in a leader is to invite challenge. And I'm going to do that for you. And I expect it. I expect it in return. So I hope that's what we'll do.
We're going to leave this trying to overcome British politeness by popularising the saying, channel your inner Zamila in this moment, so that you can say the blunt thing. Joanna.
So I'm pretty optimistic for the future. I do think that the current climate has given us a platform to have this conversation, but we need to do more than have the conversation. And I think certainly my experience from my own profession is that there needs to be quite dramatic and radical change in the organisational structures and change in the mindset. And I think if we're going to achieve that, I agree with you entirely. We've got to do it collaboratively and collectively, and with the buy-in from men as well as women, and doing it in an intersectional way. So I absolutely agree with all of that. But I am quite optimistic, not least because, and I'm going to go back to the very British thing, today Wisden's Cricket Almanac, which, as anyone interested in cricket will know, is a kind of bastion of...
If this is going to end in ball tampering, I'm going to stop you there.
I wasn't even going to dream of it.
Right.
But for the first time since 1889, there is a female cricketer on the front page of the almanac, which was published today. and 3 of the top 5 cricketers of the year are female. And, you know, if cricket can do it, anybody can do it. So I'm pretty optimistic. In terms of kind of last piece of advice, well, I think it's really difficult to boil it down to one, but I would say be brave, put yourself in situations that are challenging constantly, because I think that opens up huge amounts of opportunity. And the other thing, my husband said to me, before I took my job as a partner at Baker McKenzie, I was umming and ahhing about whether I should do it and whether it was going to be too much with the kids. And he said, you know, don't take a decision thinking it's set in stone forever. Take a decision that's exciting, and if you don't like it, just do something else. And actually, that has really liberated me in my career to think nothing is irreversible. So be brave, jump in, reverse it if you need to do it, and it will be fine.
I think there's some very good words to end on, being blunt, being brave. It's been a great conversation. Can I ask you now to thank our panellists and then to join us for a small refreshment. King's College only has a limited budget, so it's a small refreshment. But thank you very much for joining us, and thank you very much to the panel.